Jakob, let me start with you. We just heard a little bit about the Ukraine crisis, and this has taken a lot of attention and it's well needed. But it's far from the only humanitarian crisis we are facing globally today. Can you take us through some of the big challenges we are facing?
Yeah, first and foremost it's obviously always touching to hear people from the Ukraine and people living in crises at the moment to hear their stories and the challenges that they are facing. And although the Ukrainian crisis has gotten a lot of attention, unfortunately, it's far from the only humanitarian crisis that we're seeing in the world today. In fact, and I think I have a slide here that we can put up, the number of people that are living in humanitarian crisis and that is in need of humanitarian assistance in order to survive is dramatically increasing. So this chart that you see here is from 2015. There were some 90 million people, according to the UN, that were in need of humanitarian assistance in the world. Today, in the mid-2022, we're up in 308 million people. You can see that the shift has been dramatic in just the last number of years. And we're talking about 20, 30 plus different types of contexts where people are living in horrible situations and in need of this kind of support to survive. If we go to the next slide, there's a number of reasons for this. And I could talk forever about the complexity of the world. But one really clear trend that we see is the increasing number and intensity and complexity of conflicts around the world. The Russian invasion is one of those, but we see an increasing number of civil wars, civil strifes, unnamed armed groups in various territories that are causing havoc. And this is driving, and I would say is maybe the main driver of humanitarian needs in the world today. We have climate change, obviously, that we're seeing, like the floods that we see in Pakistan right now is maybe the latest example. The drought that we're seeing on the Horn of Africa, these are very much related to a changing environment, a changing climate that's having a detrimental impact on the very poorest people. The pandemic has done its part, and primarily the secondary effects of the pandemic, the complexity that this has shown for the most marginalized, most vulnerable people, primarily in terms of them becoming poorer and not being able to sustain their own livelihoods and their own lives. And then we have, on top of this, partially as a consequence, but not only, of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we have a global recession. And if you think of these 308 million people of the world, these are the poorest of the poor. These are the most marginalized, the most vulnerable people in the world. And these are the guys that are going to be suffering the most as a result of this. So today, there are 308 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. Jointly, the international humanitarian community is trying to target 206 million of these. We're not even attempting to target all of them because there's not enough capacity. That's at a cost of approximately 49 billion US dollars. This is not small money that we're talking about in order to meet these needs. And currently, even though everybody is scrambling and digging through their pockets to see how we can support, this year, to meet these needs, collectively, the various governments of the world had collected some 34% of that funding. 34% of the funding needed to meet the 206 million out of the 308 million.
That was some sad statistic, but very important to know better so we can do better. David, we mentioned some of the environmental situation, the drought in the Horn of Africa, the flooding in Pakistan. A lot of these crises are also at the same time as an environmental crisis. Can you tell us a little bit more about how it looks like in the world right now when it comes to the environmental crisis?
Yeah, we are on a bumpy ride now. Besides what Jakob was just telling us about the humanitarian situation, the kind of preconditions for living good human lives and decreasing poverty, etc., is degrading very, very severely. Last 15 years, or around 15 years ago, my colleagues were developing the planetary boundaries in order to set what is a resilient planet, like which are the 9 boundaries we need to stay within in order to ensure that we can live good human lives. And at that time, some of these had been quantified: climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. And then 4 out of 9 were considered being transgressed. This year, we got new research saying that we've also transgressed the planetary boundary on freshwater and the planetary boundaries of novel entities. That is what we human put into the environment in the form of plastics. So we're in a very dangerous situation. We're degrading the resilience of the planet. And who's harming the most for this? It's the global poor. It's the poor populations in the world that already are suffering, that will be hit the hardest by climate change, by flooding, by all the consequences that we see from transgressing the planetary boundaries.
And I think you also had a video to show us. Maybe we can screen that right now. Thank you very much. You want to comment maybe on Earth for All?
Right, so next week, in a week's time, in the opening of the General Assembly at the UN, we are launching a new book called Earth for All. And it's an update of some research that was done 50 years ago. 50 years ago, we had a book called The Limits to Growth that was trying to predict and look at how will the world population look at in the middle of the 20th century. Between around 2000 and 2050, back then, the fear was that we are reaching a lot of planetary limits that will kick back on us. And we will see this in the form of the increasing hunger. We will see it in forms of other environmental problems that are then hitting back on the whole population of the world. In the sense that already in 1970, they were saying that in the 2020s, on top of the political agenda on the world level will be the environmental crisis. And that's really what we're seeing now.
I was going to say, can you tell me what stocks to buy? Because clearly they're spot on. So obviously none of this is happening in a vacuum. It's part of like what's happening in the world, and we are heading pretty much straight into a global recession. How does that affect your work and the strategies within your work and your fields?
Well, if I start, I think, as I was saying, the global recession, the impact of the global recession is going to hit the poorest the hardest. In terms of humanitarian consequences, we're going to see some of the poorest people being pushed into even deeper poverty, which are going to have detrimental effects for their opportunities to kind of for their own upkeep and might be in need of humanitarian assistance to survive. So that's one impact. The other thing is obviously the costs of responding to these humanitarian needs are also increasing. As inflation are rising, the cost for logistics, for transportation of goods, for various procurements are going to increase, and therefore the limited money that's already available is going to reach even less. And thirdly, governments and companies are going to be less likely to invest, or not invest, but to donate money to interventions to meet these humanitarian needs, because there's going to be less money to go around and other priorities are going to be dominating. So unfortunately, it's detrimental to the situation for the very poorest.
And as we saw here, there's already too little money into this problem to solve it. Yeah. David?
So the way we are trying to treat this, this development, it's very sad development since the 1970s that we're seeing when it comes to the environment, despite a lot of success when it comes to increasing human well-being across the world. Despite of the humanitarian crisis right now, we really have seen increasing number of people getting education all over the world. Health is increasing a lot all over the world, as Hans Rosling was pointing out. So we are seeing that some positive signs at the same time as we are kind of entering a very fragile era, fragile dominion. So what we are doing here in the Earth for All project, and the book that will be launched next week, written by Johan Rockström, Owen Gaffney, and others which you're may be aware of, is that we tried to use the modeling techniques back from the 1970s, update them, looking at the current situation, and instead of saying, where are we heading, which we do, but we're also looking at how can we create a giant leap? How can we create a better future that looks different? So I think that's something that academia has not done so much. We're a lot of in the domain of assessing, the planetary boundaries. Where are we now? Where are we heading? So there is a risk of this kind of doomsday talk, which I think is important, because we also need to stress that the situation is very bad. But what we're doing here is that we're showing that there are 5 different areas that require a lot of investment, a lot of change. So the 5 areas is inequality, is poverty, gender equality, energy, and food. And then we propose in this book actions on all of these. And in the global model that we created, so my background is partly as a computer modeler for this project. So we're seeing with these 5 turnarounds, we can see that we can actually reach the Paris Agreement. We can reach at least below 2 degrees at the end of the century. We can decrease global poverty, eradicate poverty by the end of the century, and so on and so forth. So we see that there is still room for massive change, but it requires at least these 5 turnarounds that we are talking about.
Can I just add to that? I think it's really interesting because you're mentioning the Rosling, and those of you who know Hans Rosling and his famous bubble diagram, the world is actually getting better, and we just don't really pay attention to it. And that's true for the majority of the people. However, there's a small amount of people relatively to the world's population. These 308 million people that I'm talking about, where the situation is getting worse. So overall, the situation is getting better for humankind, but for the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, it's getting worse. This is an equity problem. This is an equality problem, and I think exactly what you're talking about, these 5 turnarounds. So we're doing the right things in a way, but we need to do them in a different way to be able to kind of gather everybody under this umbrella of making the world a better place.
And speaking of that, of doing the right thing, obviously these are global issues that demands global solutions. What current collaborations are working well and should be increased, and what is missing?
Well, from my point of view, I think a lot of these things, and as you're seeing in terms of what are we pointing at, what kind of challenges are driving this development, they're all global problems, and there needs to be global solutions to this. So for me, the answer is very simple. It's multilateralism. We need to collaborate. We need to look at this from an international perspective and not from a nationalistic, egocentric type of perspective of making life better for myself or for my country only. We need to look at these transnational problems with a transnational lens. So therefore, what we do see in terms of humanitarian assistance or overseas development assistance is really the need and importance of global collaboration and multilateral actors to go in and step up, and for us to invest in that.
Yeah, and as Jakob points out, I think it's very important to focus on the global, having the global lens, but also multilateralism is including lateralism. I mean, it's including the countries. So we really need urgent change in every country of the world. So we cannot say that, oh, another country will do this, or we are too small to make a difference. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg. Was she too small to make a difference? So I think that we all need to work together. And also looking at the Swedish situation, inequality in Sweden has been growing the last 30 years. And if you look at gender equality, the representation in the Swedish parliament has been going down of women the last 15 years, since 2006. So that's one of the SDG targets that we are failing on. So even where we think that we are the world best in gender equality and inequality, Sweden is failing at the moment. And I think it's important to interconnect these issues, because what we are saying in Earth for All is that, yes, we're heading into environmental crisis, but in order to do something about it, we need social cohesion, we need people to cooperate, we need people to feel important, we need people to feel that they are part of society. Therefore, we really need to tackle inequality. We need to tackle gender equality in order for people to feel that, yes, we're doing this together, we're in this boat together.
I also want to ask you guys a little bit about how we, because I feel like we're always talking about how to solve a crisis. How do we stop them from even happening? And that's a big question, but I would like to frame it as what kind of strategies do you think are needed to build resilience into our systems and into our structures?
Well, from our point of view, I think this is incredibly important. And as humanitarians, I mean, we look at the, we respond to these crises. Our mandate is really to save lives and alleviate suffering in the most immediate future. And as you see, you know, in terms of the funding available, we really need to prioritize. We need to prioritize the most severe needs and the most acute situations. That being said, there's a number of people that are living on the edge of this happening. Some of them that are actually in need right now and that will not be receiving assistance. And as a consequence, the number of people in the most acute and severe need of humanitarian assistance is going to continue to grow. That's in the short-term perspective. And then obviously we have the long-term. Humanitarian interventions, for instance, we're the firefighters of this. And when the world is burning, the firefighters are not the ones that are going to be able to solve the problems. We might be able to calm the fire, but that's not the solution, that's not the long-term solution. So what we really need to do is to build resilience. And I think we need to build resilience in the communities that are being affected. We need to build resilience in the national structures and systems in order to capacitate them to be able to respond to this kind of situation. But really what it's about is to make sure that communities themselves can withstand shock, can withstand stress, so that the impact of events, because the floods will happen, you know, the storms will come, the droughts will happen, there will always be conflict. It's a matter of how you minimize the consequences of that and how you build a resilience. And from my point of view, that needs to be done at the community level and to build a community resilience.
Mm. Do you agree?
Yes, very much. And I think that you frame it very well to say that your humanitarian aid is treating basically the collapsed societies, the people that are really at the bottom. And coming from the Resilience Center, where we talk a lot about these issues, resilience is not the opposite of, I mean, resilience and stability is not the same word. So there will be shocks, but we need societies to be able to handle them. And building resilience over time, if we look at different systems, how they have moved and when they are increasing in resilience and so on and so forth. If we look at the personal level, for example, personal resilience is often built after a crisis. So when you experience a loss of someone close to you, for example, in the worst case, you collapse and you need someone to pick you up. In the best case, you also, through this process, start to build resilience. You start to understand that, yes, I can go through this and I can get people helping me through this, and then you come out as a stronger person. From a country perspective, looking at where we are now with the horrible situation in Ukraine, but if you look at how Europe has acted here, we have acted as a European Union, I think, quite heavily and quite much in cooperation. Comparing to, I think, what would have been the case without having the COVID pandemic just before. And why is it so? Because the COVID pandemic is a typical example of this kind of outside shock that is disturbing a system. What happened? I think that a lot of borders were closed, countries were kind of started to fight between each other. But in the longer run, it helped us build resilience. It helped us realize that, yes, we need institutions in order to work together as the European Union, for example. And then when we're experiencing this new crisis, the war in Ukraine, hopefully the EU has learned, and Europe has learned, and the world has learned to better work together. So shocks, it's kind of paradoxical how these kind of shocks are also helping to build resilience in societies and countries.
It's an opportunity for learning, I hear.
Exactly, and we really need to encourage learning. We need to look into that. That's a way of kind of building resilient societies, to encourage the learning from different kind of shocks.
If I could just add to that, I completely agree, but at the same time, what we have learned, and I'm sorry to break it to you, the reason why we're so engaged in the Ukraine is because, we as in Europe, is because it's in our backyard. We're afraid that this is going to affect us. We're not, I don't hear anybody talking about the conflict in Burkina Faso, you know, because it's not necessarily affecting us. What we need to realize, and what a lesson I think we can learn from the pandemic, is that even things that happen far away from you can have a detrimental impact to your life, to your society, and to everything that happens. And therefore, we cannot isolate these kind of crises. We cannot isolate these kind of events. We need to address all of them, because if not only from a moral standpoint, that we need to help our brothers and sisters of humankind, it's also for your own sake. Because if we let this go and we have a world where crisis is going to be, a pandemic of various types of crisis, it's going to come back and it's going to impact even us. And I think that's also an important lesson to learn from this.
So droughts are going to happen, flooding is going to happen, conflict crises are going to happen. How do you look at social innovation's role in solving some of these crises?
Well, I can start. I think social innovation is an incredibly powerful tool when it comes to finding innovative ways to deal with this. If you look at it from my sector's perspective, the humanitarian assistance, or from development aid, well, I mean, look at the numbers. We're clearly failing. We need to think about how we're going to do this differently. This is not going to be done at the General Assembly in New York. I'm sorry. I'm confident that these thoughts of how we can do things differently, how we can partner outside the established mechanisms, institutions, or whatever that already exist, can come from various kinds of social innovation. So I think that has an extremely powerful role to play, and it starts in the community, it starts at the local level, and then it can be built upon, and it can really inspire change from the big global actors that needs to learn how to do things differently. So partnering from these kind of institutions with social innovators and those kind of initiatives can be extremely powerful, and possibly what would make the difference.
Act local, think global.
Yes, and to add to this, I mean, going back to what we have framed as the 7 resilience principles. One is this encouraging learning in the system, and another one is encouraging diversity and promoting diversity, promoting different ways to solve a problem. Looking at the COVID pandemic as an example, different countries handle it differently. They had different kinds of strengths, different kind of weaknesses coming out. We may be better in seeing which solutions worked. And it's probably beneficial for the world that we did not all handle it the same way. And in the same way, when you look at social entrepreneurs and social businesses, they are the kind of the diversity of different ways to handle problems, different ways to tackle solutions. And I think that social entrepreneurs also have a big role in a very difficult situation. We saw our colleague here from Ukraine talking before. And I think the crisis difficulties also encourage people to find new solutions.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to the end of the time here, but I would like to end on a somewhat hopeful note. So I would like to ask you, what are you looking forward to? What insights do you feel like are there and moving in the right direction? What do you feel like going good? Bring a Hans Rosling's spirit into these rooms. Is things on some point getting better? And if not, how can we help for them to get better as individuals?
I would say the level of attention, thanks to the pandemic, thanks to Ukraine, thanks to various kind of situations like the floods, and as we're seeing all these dramatic events happening in front of our eyes, the awareness amongst people of what is going on and the need to change is apparent. This is changing. The landscape is changing, and the mindset of individuals is changing. And we see this not only amongst the communities, and I've always been impressed by communities and how strong they can be in the face of crises. But this mindset is changing even in countries and communities such as our own, which is not necessarily facing a crisis in any ways, and we're realizing that something needs to be done. And Mobilize starts from realization. So I'm hopeful that we can change this.
The strength of community. Thank you.
Yeah, and what we've seen, I think, in the beginning of the 2000s, like the last 20 years, is we're entering a very different world in so many ways that we did before, thanks to a lot of different new technique, thanks to social media in many ways, etc. At the moment, it has been used to polarize. It has been very difficult for the societies to handle this new force. But I think there's also a lot of room for improvement, room for from a cosmopolitan perspective, also understanding suffering very far from here, for example, because we have a global community. We're building a global community. The climate movement is one, but we also should see this as a possibility for a humanitarian movement, looking at crises all over the world, understanding that we are one.
understanding that we are one and looking at the global communities. Thank you very much. A big round of applause to Jakob and David.